A dying buffalo covered in bugs was suffering by the side of the road while everyone just watched, until someone stopped. What seemed like a simple act of kindness unfolded a story marked by abandonment, old scars, and a past many would rather forget. What came next wasn't just a rescue, it was a direct confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Watch until the end, and if this story touched you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this invisible struggle. Heat seemed to rise from the very ground itself on that sweltering afternoon, making the air shimmer. Above the dirt road that cut through a remote region of Montana, where time seemed to move more slowly. Mason Thompson wiped the sweat from his brow as he drove his old pickup truck. The windows rolled down in a futile attempt to catch any hint of a breeze. The endless stretch of dusty road and the vast, empty landscape reminded him why he had once loved this place and why he had eventually left it behind. His return to Whispering Pines County after 15 years away wasn't by choice. The family ranch he'd inherited after his father's passing needed to be sold, and the paperwork required his presence. 3 days, he told himself. 3 days to sign the documents, clear out any personal belongings, and leave this place behind. For good. The sooner he returned to his quiet life in Seattle, the better. The radio crackled with static as Mason drove further from town. He was taking the long route to the ranch, the scenic drive as locals called it, though there wasn't much to see besides rolling hills and the occasional abandoned structure. He wasn't ready to face the ranch just yet, to see the empty fields where cattle once grazed and the house where memories still lingered like ghosts. Mason slowed the truck as he rounded a bend in the road, his eyes catching an unusual shape. In the distance, at first he thought it might be a fallen tree or perhaps some debris from a recent storm, but as he drew closer, the shape took a more distinct form. His heart sank as recognition dawned. It was a buffalo, or what remained of, an animal that must have once been magnificent. Its emaciated body lay motionless at the edge of the road, dark fur matted and dull in the harsh sunlight. Mason pulled his truck to the side of the road, his mind racing. Buffalo weren't common in this particular area anymore, though they had once roamed these plains in great herds. This one was clearly domesticated, likely from one of the newer buffalo ranches that had sprung up in recent years as the demand for buffalo meat increased. Through his open window, Mason could hear the buzz of insects around the animal. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. The buffalo was alive, but barely. How long had it been there? Hours? Days? The thought made Mason wince. As he watched, a sleek SUV slowed as it approached, the driver's face appearing briefly. In the window, the woman inside took a quick photo with her phone before speeding away, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. Mason frowned. It wasn't the first vehicle to pass by. Tire tracks in the dirt told a story of many who had come and gone, bearing witness to the animal's suffering without stopping to help. He should drive away too. This wasn't his problem. He had enough. Ghosts to contend with without adding another. But as Mason put his hand on the gear shift, he caught sight of the buffalo's eye, a dim light, but still present, still fighting. Something in that gaze held him there, an unspoken plea that resonated with a part of him he thought he'd buried long ago. "Damn it," Mason muttered, putting the truck in park and shutting off the engine. The sudden silence was profound. No traffic noise, no radio static, just the whisper of a hot breeze through the tall grass and the distant call of a hawk. Mason sat for several minutes, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he wrestled with himself. Every instinct told him to leave, to stay uninvolved. He'd learned the hard way what happens when you try to save something that's already too far gone. But those eyes. With a resigned sigh, Mason grabbed his water bottle and stepped out into the heat. The scorched earth crunched beneath his boots as he approached the buffalo, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Up close, the animal's condition was even worse than he'd thought. Its hide was marked with sores where it had lain too long, in one position, and flies buzzed around its nostrils and eyes. The smell was pungent, a mixture of sweat, exposed wounds, and the slow decay of hope. Mason crouched a few feet away, speaking in low, gentle tones as he unscrewed his water bottle. "Hey there, big guy. Been having a rough time, haven't you?" The buffalo's eye tracked his movement, but its body remained still, too weak to respond to a potential threat. Mason poured some water onto the parched ground near the animal's mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with tremendous effort, the buffalo shifted its massive head just enough to reach the moisture, its dry tongue working feebly to lap at the damp earth. "That's it," Mason encouraged, pouring more water, this time directly into a small depression where the buffalo could more easily reach it. Small steps. The distant rumble of thunder caught Mason's attention. He glanced up to see dark clouds gathering on the horizon, a dust storm brewing by the look of it. They were common in this part of Montana during the dry season, and this one appeared to be heading straight for them. If he was going to help this animal, he needed to act quickly. Mason returned to his truck, rummaging through the toolbox in the bed until he found an old rope. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. He also grabbed a tarp he kept for emergencies and a first aid kit that had seen better days. As he gathered his makeshift supplies, he was already questioning his sanity. What was he planning to do with a 1,000-pound animal too weak to stand? Even if he could somehow get it into his truck, where would he take it? Sarah Mitchell's face flashed in his mind. His childhood friend now ran a small animal sanctuary just outside of town. They hadn't spoken since he'd left all those years ago. Another relationship sacrificed on the altar of his need to escape. But if anyone would know what to do, it would be Sarah. The first gust of wind brought a spray of dust that stung Mason's eyes as he returned to the buffalo. Time was running out. With careful movements, he managed to loop the rope around the animal's massive shoulders. Every touch seemed to cause the buffalo pain, but there was no avoiding it. Mason murmured apologies as he worked, trying to prepare the animal for what would come next. "I need you to try," he said, knowing the buffalo couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone might provide some comfort. "Just a little effort. I can't do this alone." With the rope secured, Mason began to pull, using his truck as an anchor point. The buffalo made a low, mournful sound, the first noise Mason had heard from it, and struggled to move its legs beneath its body. The effort was visibly exhausting, each attempt accompanied by violent tremors that shook the animal's entire frame. The wind was picking up strength now, bringing with it a wall of dust that reduced visibility to mere feet. Mason spread the tarp over the buffalo, tucking it around its body as best he could, then positioned himself as a shield between the animal and the brunt of the storm. As darkness fell and the storm engulfed them, Mason hunkered down beside the buffalo, one hand resting on its heaving side, both of them fighting separate battles for survival. Through the howling wind and swirling dust, Mason spoke to the buffalo about everything and nothing, about the ranch he'd fled, about his father's disappointed eyes, about the accident that had driven him away from Whispering Pines. Words he hadn't spoken in 15 years poured out of him, carried away by the storm like seeds scattered to uncertain soil. Dawn broke with merciful gentleness after the violence of the storm. Mason awoke with a start, his body stiff from spending the night huddled against his truck. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. Why was he out here instead of at a motel in town? Then he saw the massive form beneath the dust-covered tarp, and memories of the previous day came rushing back. "You're still with us," Mason said softly, relief flooding through him as he noticed the buffalo's sides rising and falling with slightly stronger breaths than before. Against all odds, the animal had survived the night. Mason's truck was covered in a thick layer of dust, but it started without protest. Leaving the buffalo briefly, he drove to the nearest intersection where he knew he'd get cell reception. His fingers hovered over Sarah Mitchell's name in his contacts list. He'd never deleted it, though he'd never used it either, before finally pressing call. Wildwood Haven Animal Sanctuary. A warm, familiar voice answered. Sarah, it's Mason Thompson. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Mason to wonder if she'd hung up. Mason, she finally said, her tone guarded, I heard you were back in town. News travels fast. Some things never change. A pause. What can I do for you? Mason explained the situation as concisely as possible, omitting his emotional reaction to the abandoned buffalo. Sarah listened without interruption, though Mason could almost feel her professional demeanor taking over, the same quiet determination she'd shown nursing injured birds back to health when they were teenagers. I can meet you there with my trailer in an hour, she said when he'd finished. Don't try to move him on your own. Mason spent the hour carefully offering water to the buffalo, which seemed marginally more responsive in the morning light. When Sarah's white truck appeared on the horizon, pulling a livestock trailer behind it, Mason felt a complicated mixture of gratitude and apprehension. The last time he'd seen Sarah had been on the worst day of his life, when harsh words had been exchanged that could never be taken back. The woman who stepped out of the truck was both familiar and a stranger. Sarah's chestnut hair was shorter now, streaked with premature silver at the temples, but her eyes were the same deep green that had once seen right through his carefully constructed defenses. She wore work clothes, sturdy jeans, boots, and a faded blue shirt with her sanctuary's logo embroidered on the pocket, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was. You look good, Mason, she said, her expression giving nothing away. Seattle must agree with you. You look good too, he replied, then quickly added, Thank you for coming. Sarah nodded, her attention already shifting to the buffalo. She knelt beside the animal, her experienced hands moving gently over its body, assessing its condition. With clinical efficiency, he's severely dehydrated and malnourished, she said. Probably been out here for days. It's a miracle he's still alive. She glanced up at Mason with a flash of the old Sarah, the passionate defender of all creatures. Good thing you stopped. I almost didn't, Mason admitted. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't comment further. Together they worked to prepare the buffalo for transport, Sarah administering emergency fluids and pain medication from her well-stocked kit. The process of getting the weakened animal into the trailer was painstaking and took nearly 2 hours, but eventually they succeeded. Follow me back to Wildwood, Sarah said as she closed the trailer gate. We've got a better chance of saving him there. The drive to Wildwood Haven took them deeper into the countryside, along winding roads that Mason had once known like the back of his hand. Sarah's sanctuary sat on 20 acres of land that had once been part of her family's farm. Mason remembered when it had been nothing more than a dream she'd shared with him during long summer afternoons by the creek. Now, Wildwood Haven was clearly established, with proper fencing, several outbuildings and pastures where Mason could see horses, goats, and even a few elderly cows grazing peacefully. A modestly sized house painted buttercup yellow stood near the entrance, with flower beds that exploded with wildflowers. It was exactly the kind of place he could have pictured Sarah creating all those years ago. They unloaded the buffalo into a prepared stall in the largest barn, where Sarah had already set up an IV drip and soft bedding. A tall, lanky man with kind eyes assisted them, introducing himself as Dr. Jake Wilson, the local veterinarian who volunteered at the sanctuary. He's in rough shape, Dr. Wilson said after a thorough examination, but buffaloes are incredibly resilient. If he's made it this far, he's got a fighting chance. Mason watched as they worked, feeling increasingly out of place in this world that Sarah had built without him. He should leave now, he told himself. The buffalo was in good hands. His obligation was fulfilled. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Perhaps the way the buffalo's eyes still seemed to follow him, a silent communication he couldn't interpret, but felt deeply nonetheless. "You can go if you need to," Sarah said, as if reading his thoughts. "I know you must have things to take care of at the ranch." "I can stay a while longer," Mason found himself saying, "if that's okay." Sarah gave him a long look before nodding. "There's coffee in the house. Help yourself. This might take a while." The hours blended together as Mason alternated between sitting with the buffalo and giving Sarah and Dr. Wilson space to work. By late afternoon, the initial crisis had passed. The buffalo was stable, though still dangerously weak. Dr. Wilson departed with promises to return the next day, leaving Sarah and Mason alone with their new charge. "He needs a name," Sarah said, as they watched the buffalo take small, tentative sips from a water bucket. "We can't just keep calling him the buffalo." Mason thought for a moment. "Survivor," he suggested. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Fitting." She hesitated, then added, "I never pegged you for someone who'd spend the night in a dust storm for an animal." "People change," Mason said, though he wasn't entirely convinced this was true of himself. "Sometimes," Sarah agreed, her tone neutral. She handed him a soft brush. "Here, gentle strokes along his side. It'll help clean some of this dirt off and give us a better look at his condition." As Mason brushed the buffalo's matted fur, layers of dust and dried mud fell away, revealing skin, marked by neglect and hardship. Sarah worked alongside him, carefully cleaning areas where sores had formed. It was as she cleansed a particularly deep wound on the buffalo's flank that she paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Mason, look at this." Beneath the dirt and dried blood was a mark, not a random injury, but a deliberate brand, partially obscured by time and newer wounds. Sarah gently cleaned it further, revealing a distinctive pattern. 2 interlocked B's. "Black Butte Ranch," Sarah said, her voice tight. "I should have known." "What's Black Butte Ranch?" Sarah's eyes darkened. "Richard Blackwood's operation. He started it about 10 years ago, one of those luxury buffalo meat producers that market to high-end restaurants. Very exclusive, very profitable. And they just abandoned this animal. When they're no longer profitable, yes." Sarah's voice was bitter. "This isn't the first animal from Black Butte I've seen discarded like garbage, but usually they don't." She trailed off, her hand gentle on Survivor's side. "Usually they don't what?" "Usually they make sure the animals don't survive to tell the tale," she said grimly. "Whatever they're doing over there, they don't want evidence walking around." Mason felt a chill despite the warmth of the barn. "You think they left him to die on purpose?" "I think Richard Blackwood cares about profit margins, not animal welfare. And I think there's a reason he builds his fences so high and keeps visitors to a minimum." She straightened up, determination etched into the lines of her face. "This mark changes things, Mason. If Blackwood's people realize one of their animals is here, they might come looking. What do they care about one buffalo?" Sarah's expression was grim. "That's what I'd like to know." Over the next few days, a routine developed. Mason delayed his plans to return to Seattle, telling himself it was because the ranch paperwork was taking longer than expected. In reality, he found himself drawn back to Wildwood Haven each day, watching as Survivor slowly began to show signs of improvement. 1 week after Survivor's rescue, Mason arrived at Wildwood Haven earlier than usual, carrying breakfast from the local diner, a peace offering of sorts, though he wasn't sure Sarah would see it that way. The morning air was crisp, the first hint of autumn beginning to color the edges of summer. Mason found himself noticing these Small details more than he had in years, as if his senses had been dulled by city life and were only now reawakening. He found Sarah in the barn, already hard at work. Survivor had been moved to a larger enclosure with access to a small, fenced outdoor area. The buffalo still couldn't stand for long periods, but he was eating regularly now and showing more alertness with each passing day. "You're early," Sarah commented, accepting the offered coffee with a nod of thanks. "Couldn't sleep," Mason admitted. This wasn't unusual. Sleep had been elusive since his return to Whispering Pines, his nights filled with fragmented dreams and old memories. Sarah studied him for a moment, then gestured toward Survivor. He tried to stand for almost 10 minutes. "Yesterday, longest yet." Mason approached the buffalo, who acknowledged him with a gentle huff. Over the past week, something unexpected had developed between them, a connection that went beyond rescuer and rescued. Mason found himself talking to Survivor during his visits, sharing thoughts he wouldn't dare voice to another human, not even Sarah. There was something cathartic about the buffalo's silent presence, his non-judgmental gaze. "I've been doing some digging," Sarah said after they'd finished their breakfast, sitting on hay bales with empty containers between them. "About Black Butte Ranch," Mason raised an eyebrow. "And?" "They're hosting a charity gala next weekend. Sustainable buffalo ranching for the future, they're calling it." Her tone made it clear what she thought of this description. "It's a fundraiser for some agricultural lobbying group, but really it's a marketing event. $500 a plate to taste their premium buffalo products and tour their state-of-the-art facilities. Sounds pretentious." "It's also an opportunity," Sarah said, her eyes meeting his with purpose, "to see what's really happening there." Mason felt a familiar unease settle in his stomach, the same feeling he'd had when Sarah had convinced him to help her release minks from a fur farm when they were 17. That adventure had ended with both of them in the back of Sheriff Davis's patrol car, and with Mason's father refusing to speak to him for weeks. "You're not seriously thinking of crashing a Black Butte gala?" "Not crashing. Attending." Sarah pulled an envelope from her pocket and handed it to Mason. Inside was an elegant invitation. "Tom Jenkins. You remember him? His daughter Lily works for an environmental law firm now. She's been trying to build a case against Blackwood for years, but he's careful. His operation looks pristine on paper. She got me this invitation." Mason handed the invitation back. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" "Evidence, records, anything to explain why Blackwood's animals keep ending up abandoned or worse." She hesitated. "And I need you to come with me." "Me? Why?" "Because you're Mason Thompson, prodigal son of one of the oldest ranching families in the county. Your presence won't raise suspicions." She held his gaze steadily. "And because I could use someone watching my back." Mason wanted to refuse. He had spent 15 years building a new life, one where he wasn't entangled in local dramas or crusades. He had a flight booked back to Seattle in 3 days. The ranch was nearly ready to list for sale. There was nothing holding him here, nothing except the memory of a dust storm and the eyes of a buffalo who had refused to give up. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Sarah nodded, recognizing it wasn't an outright refusal. Fair enough. They spent the morning tending to Survivor and the other animals at the sanctuary. As Mason was helping Sarah repair a fence in one of the pastures, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows slowed as it passed, then continued down the road. Something about the vehicle set off warning bells in Mason's mind. "You get many visitors out this way?" he asked casually. Sarah glanced up from her work, following his gaze to the disappearing vehicle. "Not many. Why?" "That SUV. I think I've seen it before. Around town, maybe." Sarah's hands stilled on the fencing wire. "Was it the same one that passed Survivor on the road?" "I'm not sure," Mason admitted. "Could be a coincidence." I don't believe in coincidences, Sarah said, her expression hardening, not when it comes to Blackwood. Later that afternoon, Mason headed into town to meet with the real estate agent handling his father's property. Main Street was quiet, with only a few tourists browsing the Western-themed shops that catered to visitors passing through on their way to Yellowstone. Mason was about to enter the realty office when he noticed the black SUV again, parked outside the sheriff's office, across the street. Curiosity got the better of him. Mason crossed the street and entered the sheriff's department, where he found Sheriff Mike Davis, an old schoolmate who had once been a gangly, awkward teenager and was now a solidly built man with a badge, talking to a well-dressed stranger. Mason. Thompson, Mike said with genuine surprise when he spotted him. Twice in 1 month. Must be some kind of record. Just wrapping up some loose ends, Mason replied, shaking the sheriff's hand while trying to get a better look at the stranger who was studying him with undisguised interest. This is Harold Wells, Mike introduced. Mr. Wells, this is Mason. Thompson, one of our local boys who made good in the big city. Harold Wells was tall and lean, with the carefully cultivated appearance of someone who spent more time in boardrooms than outdoors. His handshake was firm, but brief, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Thompson, Wells repeated, as if committing the name to memory. Any relation to Thompson Ranch? My father's place, Mason confirmed. I'm in town to sell it, actually. Shame to see these old family operations go, Wells said, with practiced sympathy, but I suppose that's progress. Mr. Wells is head of security for Black Butte Ranch, Sheriff Davis explained. He's helping us with a problem we've been having with missing livestock in the county. Missing livestock? Mason kept his expression neutral, though his heart rate quickened. Wells nodded. Several valuable animals have been misplaced recently. It's becoming quite concerning for local ranchers. We believe they may have been stolen. That does sound concerning, Mason agreed. I hope you find them. Oh, we will, Wells assured him, his smile tightening. Black Butte has quite an investment in its animals. We don't give up easily. The conversation moved on to other topics, local gossip, how Seattle compared to Montana, but Mason remained acutely aware of Wells's calculating gaze. When he finally left the sheriff's office, he noticed the black SUV was no longer parked. Outside, Mason drove straight back to Wildwood Haven, finding Sarah in her small office adjacent to the house. Without preamble, he told her about his encounter with Wells and the missing livestock story. He's looking for Survivor, Sarah said, voicing what they were both thinking. But why? Mason asked, pacing the small room. He's just one buffalo. Why go to all this trouble? Sarah pulled out a file from her desk drawer. Maybe this is why. The file contained printed articles, notes, and photographs, a documentation of Sarah's ongoing investigation into Black Butte Ranch. She spread several photos across her desk. They showed various buffalo, all bearing the distinctive Double B brand, all in various states of poor health. These were all found abandoned or escaped over the past 3 years, Sarah explained. Most didn't survive. The few that did showed the same pattern of neglect that we've seen with Survivor. But that doesn't explain why they'd be looking for him specifically, Mason pointed out. No, it doesn't, Sarah agreed. Unless she trailed off, her gaze returning to Survivor's file. Unless there's something else, something we're missing. The next day, Dr. Wilson returned for Survivor's checkup. As he examined the buffalo, Mason noticed him paying particular attention to the branded area. Is something wrong? Mason asked. The veterinarian hesitated. Probably nothing, but I'd like to run some blood tests. More extensive ones than we did initially. What are you looking for? Sarah asked, her voice sharp with concern. It's just a precaution, Dr. Wilson assured them. But I've treated a few buffalo before, and Survivor's symptoms weren't entirely consistent with simple neglect. There were some unusual patterns. While they waited for the blood test results, Mason accompanied Sarah on her rounds of the sanctuary. As they worked, Sarah gradually opened up about the years since he'd left, how she'd built Wildwood Haven from nothing, the challenges she'd faced, the small victories that kept her going. Mason found himself sharing too. His architectural firm in Seattle, the life he'd constructed that looked perfect on paper, but felt increasingly hollow. "Why did you really come back, Mason?" Sarah asked as they sat on her porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "After all this time?" Mason swirled the iced tea in his glass, buying time. "My father's lawyer said I needed to sign the papers in person." "You could have signed them and left the same day," Sarah pointed out. "You've been here for over 2 weeks now." The truth was, Mason wasn't entirely sure himself. The pull he felt to stay had grown stronger each day, like roots slowly taking hold in soil he'd once been desperate to escape. "I guess I needed to see it one more time," he admitted, "to make sure I was making the right decision by letting it go." "And are you?" Mason thought about the emptiness of the ranch, the weight of memories that haunted every corner. Then he thought about the past 2 weeks, about dust storms and buffalo eyes, about early mornings at the sanctuary and quiet evenings on this very porch. Before he could answer, Sarah's phone rang. It was Dr. Wilson. "The test results are in," Sarah said after a brief conversation. Her expression was a mixture of concern and vindication. "Mason, you need to hear this." Inside the house, Sarah pulled up her laptop to start a video call with Dr. Wilson. The veterinarian's face appeared on screen, his expression grave. "I found something unusual in Survivor's blood work," he began without preamble. "Traces of an experimental growth hormone that isn't approved for use in livestock in the United States. It's designed to accelerate weight gain and muscle development, but it's been linked to severe health issues in trial animals. They're using their buffalo as test subjects," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. "It appears so," Dr. Wilson agreed. "And based on these levels, Survivor was receiving very high doses, much higher than would be used in any legitimate research. The pattern of muscle wastage and organ strain we're seeing is consistent with withdrawal from the hormone." So they weren't just abandoning him because he was no longer productive, Mason realized. They were disposing of evidence. "That would explain why Blackwood is so interested in finding him," Sarah said. "Survivor isn't just a discarded animal, he's proof of illegal experimentation." The Black Butte Charity Gala was being held at the sprawling main ranch house, a modern interpretation of a traditional ranch home with soaring ceilings and walls of glass that showcased the mountain views. Mason adjusted his tie as he and Sarah approached the entrance, where valets were parking gleaming luxury vehicles and staff in crisp uniforms greeted arriving guests. "Remember the plan," Sarah murmured, her hand resting lightly on Mason's arm. She looked transformed in an elegant emerald dress that matched her eyes, her usual practical attire replaced with the polished appearance of a wealthy donor. "We're just here to learn more about investing in sustainable ranching." Mason nodded, acutely aware of how easily they could be discovered. The past week had been a flurry of preparation, securing evidence of the experimental hormones from Dr. Wilson, documenting Survivor's condition, and coordinating with Lily Jenkins to understand exactly what they needed to find to build a legal case against Blackwood. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it?" A smooth voice interrupted Mason's thoughts. Harold Wells approached them, now dressed in an expensive suit rather than the business casual attire he'd worn at the sheriff's office. His smile was as cold as ever. What a pleasant surprise. "Mr. Wells," Mason acknowledged. "This is my friend Sarah Mitchell." "Ms. Mitchell," Wells said, taking her offered hand. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure, though your name does sound familiar." "I run a small operation outside of town," Sarah replied with practiced ease. "Wildwood Haven." "Ah, yes. The animal sanctuary." Something flickered in Wells' eyes. Recognition, certainly, but also calculation. How compassionate of you. I didn't realize you had an interest in commercial ranching. I'm interested in all aspects of animal welfare, Sarah said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, including how operations like Black Butte are redefining industry standards. Wells studied her for a moment too long before gesturing toward the main reception area. Well, you've certainly come to the right place. Please enjoy yourselves. Mr. Blackwood will be giving a tour of our facilities later this evening. I'm sure you'll find it enlightening. As Wells moved away to greet other guests, Mason let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He knows who you are. Of course he does, Sarah replied quietly. But he can't throw us out without causing a scene, not with all these potential investors watching. They moved through the elegantly decorated great room, where guests in formal attire mingled around displays of Black Butte's award-winning products. Servers circulated with trays of appetizers featuring buffalo meat, prepared in various upscale presentations. Mason accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, using it as cover to observe the room. "There's Blackwood," Sarah whispered, nodding subtly toward a distinguished-looking man holding court near the massive stone fireplace. Richard Blackwood was in his 60s, with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent significant time outdoors, though the manicured appearance of his hands suggested it had been years since he'd done actual ranch work. He projected an air of self-assured authority as he charmed the group around him, his booming laugh carrying across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice announced over discreet speakers, "Mr. Blackwood's tour of our state-of-the-art processing facilities will begin in 15 minutes. Please gather in the East Wing." "Perfect timing," Sarah murmured. That should empty out his office. They had studied the floor plan of the ranch house, available on the Black Butte website as part of their transparency campaign. Blackwood's private office was located in the West Wing, away from the public areas being showcased tonight. As the crowd began to drift toward the East Wing, Mason and Sarah moved in the opposite direction, Sarah pausing to ask a staff member about the restroom facilities. The young woman pointed down a hallway, inadvertently giving them legitimate reason to be heading away from the tour. The hallway was quiet, the sounds of the party fading as they walked deeper into the private section of the house. Mason felt his heartbeat quicken as they approached an unmarked door that, according to their research, should be Blackwood's office. "Keep watch," Sarah whispered as she tried the handle. It was locked. She reached into her small clutch purse and removed a slim case containing lock-picking tools, a skill Mason had forgotten she possessed until this moment. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked as she worked on the lock with practiced movements. "Wildlife research courses," she replied with a hint of a smile. "You'd be surprised how often you need to get into locked cabinets or storage areas when tracking endangered species." The lock clicked open, and they slipped inside, closing the door softly behind them. Blackwood's office was impressive, all dark wood and leather, with mounted buffalo heads watching from the walls like silent sentinels. A large desk dominated one end of the room, with a computer and neatly organized folders. "You check the computer. I'll look through the files," Sarah directed, moving immediately to a filing cabinet while Mason sat at the desk and woke the computer. "It's password protected," Mason said, staring at the login screen. "Try Black Butte with the year the ranch was founded, 2011, Sarah suggested as she rifled through folders. To Mason's surprise, it worked. "Amateur move for a man with secrets," he muttered as he began searching through the documents on the desktop. For several tense minutes, they worked in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of papers and the click of the mouse. Mason found financial spreadsheets showing impressive profit margins, but nothing overtly incriminating until he opened a folder labeled R&D. "Sarah, I think I found something," he said, scanning through documents detailing the experimental growth hormone program. The files confirmed everything Dr. Wilson had suspected, and worse. Internal memos discussed the side effects of the hormone, including dramatically shortened lifespans of the buffalo and potential health risks to consumers. Most damning was an email exchange with a pharmaceutical company that had explicitly warned Blackwood about the dangers of the hormone and refused to continue supplying it, followed by correspondence with an overseas supplier willing to provide it without questions. "Got it," Mason said, inserting the flash drive Sarah had prepared and beginning to copy the files. "I've found these too," Sarah said, bringing over a folder containing shipping manifests that didn't match the official records they'd seen on the company website. "They're bringing in the hormones through a shell company and labeling them as vitamin supplements." The sound of voices in the hallway froze them both. Mason quickly minimized the windows on the computer as Sarah returned the folders to the filing cabinet. The voices passed without pausing, but the close call left them both on edge. "We should go," Mason said as the file transfer completed. "We've got enough." Sarah nodded, but as they prepared to leave, something caught her eye, a map on the wall with marked locations. "Mason, look at this." The map showed the Black Butte property with several areas circled in red, labeled with dates. Sarah took out her phone and quickly photographed it. "Those could be disposal sites," she said grimly. "Places where they've abandoned animals that showed too many side effects or stopped responding to the hormone." They slipped out of the office, locking the door behind them, and made their way back to the main reception area, which was now largely empty as most guests were still on the tour. Mason was about to suggest they leave when Richard Blackwood himself appeared before them, flanked by Harold Wells. "Leaving so soon?" Blackwood asked, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You're missing the tour of our processing facility. It's quite impressive." "I'm afraid I'm not feeling well," Sarah said, placing a hand delicately on her stomach. "Too much rich food, perhaps." "That's a shame," Blackwood said, his gaze moving between them with open suspicion now. "Especially since you came all this way. I was hoping to discuss your interest in our operation." "Another time, perhaps," Mason interjected smoothly. "I've left my card with your assistant. We'd be happy to schedule a proper meeting to discuss investment opportunities." "Yes, investment," Blackwood repeated, the word coated in skepticism. "Mr. Thompson, I make it a point to know everyone in the ranching business in this county, and everyone who might have the means to invest in an operation like mine. Until recently, your name hasn't come up in either category." Mason felt Sarah tense beside him, but maintained his composure. "I've been away for some time. Seattle. But with my father's passing, I've been reconsidering my connections to Whispering Pines." "How convenient," Wells said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. "And Ms. Mitchell, finding a buffalo on the side of the road must have been quite fortunate for your sanctuary. The publicity alone would be valuable, I imagine." "I don't publicize the suffering of animals," Sarah replied, her voice cool. "No?" Blackwood's smile tightened. "Yet you seem very interested in my operation. Tell me, how is your buffalo doing? The one with the distinctive marking on his flank?" The direct reference to Survivor sent a chill down Mason's spine. They knew. Somehow they knew. "I have many animals under my care, Mr. Blackwood," Sarah said evenly. "If you believe one of them belongs to you, I suggest you take it up with the proper authorities." "Oh, I intend to," Blackwood assured her. "Sheriff Davis is a good friend. I'm sure he'd be very interested in some of the activities at your sanctuary." The threat hung in the air between them. Mason placed a protective hand at the small of Sarah's back, guiding her subtly toward the exit. "If you'll excuse us, we really must be going." Blackwood made no move to stop them, but his parting words followed them out. "This is a small county, Ms. Mitchell. Smaller than you might think." The drive back to Wildwood Haven was tense, both of them watching for headlights following them on the dark country roads. When they arrived, Sarah immediately went to check on Survivor, who greeted her with a gentle nudge of his massive head. The buffalo had continued to improve over the past days, now able to stand for longer periods and move slowly around his enclosure. "They know. He's here," Sarah said, her hand resting on Survivor's broad forehead. "It's only a matter of time before they make a move." "Then we need to move faster," Mason replied, pulling out the flash drive. "I'll send everything to Lily tonight. With what we've found, she should be able to get an injunction against Black Butte by tomorrow. But both new legal proceedings would take time they might not have if Blackwood decided to take matters into his own hands." "He can't stay here," Sarah said, voicing what they were both thinking. "Not until this is resolved." "Where can we take him?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant with thought. "There's a sanctuary in Wyoming, run by an old friend who specializes in bison rehabilitation. They've got the facilities to care for him, and they're far enough away that Blackwood won't think to look there." The decision was difficult, but necessary. By dawn, arrangements had been made. Lily had the evidence and was preparing legal documents, while Sarah's friend in Wyoming was readying a space for Survivor. All that remained was to transport a 1,000-pound buffalo across state lines without attracting attention, a daunting task, even under the best circumstances. "I'll take him," Mason said as they finalized the plans over early morning coffee. "My father's old stock trailer is still at the ranch. It's not fancy, but it's solid. No one will look twice at a Thompson trailer on these roads." Sarah studied him over the rim of her mug. "You're supposed to be signing those final papers today. Your flight back to Seattle is tomorrow." Mason met her gaze steadily. "Some things are more important." The unspoken question hung between them. What happens after? What happens when Survivor is safe, when Blackwood faces justice, when there are no more immediate battles to fight? Would Mason return to his carefully constructed life in Seattle, or was there something here in Whispering Pines worth staying for? As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the sanctuary, they prepared for Survivor's journey. The buffalo seemed to sense the importance of the moment, standing more steadily than they had yet seen, his dark eyes watching their movements with what Mason could almost believe was understanding. "I'll miss him," Sarah admitted, as they guided Survivor into the trailer with remarkable ease, as if he too knew this was necessary. "I know it's silly. We've only had him a few weeks, but—" "It's not silly," Mason assured her, reaching for her hand without thinking. "You saved his life. That creates a bond." Sarah's fingers tightened around his. "We saved his life," she corrected softly. The journey to Wyoming would take most of the day. Mason had mapped a route that avoided major highways and checkpoints, sticking to back roads he remembered from childhood hunting trips with his father. As he prepared to leave, Sarah handed him a folder. "What's this?" "Survivor's medical records and history, everything we know about him and what was done to him. My friend will need it to continue his treatment." She hesitated, then added, "And this is for you." She handed him a small, worn key that Mason recognized with a jolt of surprise. It was the key to the cabin, a small structure on the far edge of what had once been Thompson land, a place where he and Sarah had spent countless hours as teenagers, dreaming of futures that had never quite materialized. "The cabin isn't part of the ranch sale," Sarah explained. "Your father transferred the deed to me years ago, after you left. He said someone should use it, and he knew I'd always loved it there." A faint smile touched her lips. "I've kept it exactly as it was." Mason closed his fingers around the key, emotion tightening his throat. "Sarah, She shook her head. "You don't have to say anything now, just think about it. On the drive, think about where you really want to be. The question followed Mason as he drove through the familiar landscape of his childhood, Survivor a steady presence in the trailer behind him. The buffalo had come into his life by chance, a random encounter on a dusty road that could easily have ended differently if Mason had chosen to drive on by. Instead, that moment of decision had altered his course in ways he couldn't have imagined, bringing him back into Sarah's orbit and forcing him to confront the past he'd been running from for 15 years. As Wyoming's border approached, Mason's phone rang. It was Sarah. "Lily got the injunction," she said without preamble, her voice tight with excitement. "The FBI is serving search warrants at Black Butte as we speak. They're bringing charges for illegal drug importation, animal cruelty, and food safety violations." Relief flooded through Mason. "It's over then." "Not quite," Sarah cautioned. "There will be a long legal process ahead. But Blackwood's operation is shutting down, at least. For now, the animals there will need places to go." "Sounds like Wildwood Haven might be expanding," Mason said, smiling despite himself. "That depends," Sarah replied, a new note in her voice, cautious hope. "I might need a partner for something like that, someone who understands both ranching and architecture, someone who could help design proper facilities for rescued buffalo." The implication hung in the air between them, a bridge being extended across 15 years of silence and regret. "I might know someone who fits that description," Mason said softly. Hours later, as he watched Survivor take his first tentative steps into his new home, a sprawling pasture where other rescued bison grazed peacefully in the distance, Mason felt a sense of completion. The buffalo paused, turning to look back at him, as if in farewell, before moving forward into his new life. In that moment, Mason knew with certainty what his own next steps would be. The cabin looked smaller than Mason remembered, its weathered timber exterior blending into the pines that surrounded it. 3 months had passed since Survivor's journey to Wyoming, 3 months of transformation and new beginnings. Mason stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains in shades of amber and gold. Behind him, the cabin door opened and Sarah emerged, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts, her hair tousled from sleep. She joined him at the railing, her presence a quiet comfort that still amazed him after all these years apart. "Any word from Lily?" she asked, accepting the coffee mug he handed her. Mason nodded. "The plea deal is finalized. Blackwood's facing serious fines and a suspended sentence, but more importantly, he's been banned from the livestock industry for life. The remaining animals have all been placed in sanctuaries across 3 states. And Wells? Not so lucky. He's looking at actual time for tampering with evidence." Mason smiled grimly. "Turns out deleting computer files doesn't actually make them disappear." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, her expression thoughtful. "We should visit Survivor next month. Amy says he's becoming quite the patriarch in his new herd." The transformation of Whispering Pines had been just as remarkable as Survivor's recovery. Instead of selling his family's ranch, Mason had partnered with Sarah to expand Wildwood Haven, converting the old cattle operation into a sanctuary and education center. The first phase of construction was nearly complete. Modern barns designed specifically for rescued buffalo, with sustainable features that honored both the land and its new inhabitants. Mason had not returned to Seattle except to pack his belongings and resign from his firm. Instead, he had found a new purpose, applying his architectural skills to create spaces that healed rather than exploited. The cabin, once a refuge for teenage dreams, had become their shared home, a bridge between past and present. "Sometimes, I can't believe how much has changed," Sarah said, following his gaze across the landscape where the first signs of their new venture were taking shape. "All because you stopped on that road. All because Survivor refused to give up," Mason corrected gently. He taught me something important that day. What's that? That some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. Mason turned to face her, taking in the features that had become dear to him once again. Some connections, and can't be broken no matter how much time passes. Sarah's smile held the warmth of forgiveness and new hope. Speaking of connections, Tom Jenkins called yesterday. He's donating that parcel of land adjacent to the east pasture. Says he'd rather see buffalo grazing there than another subdivision. That's 50 more acres, Mason calculated, his mind already sketching possibilities. Enough for the rehabilitation center we've been talking about. Enough to make a real difference, Sarah agreed, for animals like Survivor who deserve a second chance. In the distance, the sound of construction marked the continuing transformation of the Thompson Ranch. What had once been a traditional cattle operation was evolving into something new, a place of healing and restoration, not just for abandoned animals, but for the land itself and for the two people who had found their way back to each other through an unexpected encounter on a dusty Montana road. Mason wrapped his arm around Sarah's shoulders, pulling her close as they looked out over their shared vision, taking shape before them. Some journeys ended exactly where they began, he reflected, but with everything transformed by the road traveled between. Dear listeners, we hope that Mason and Sarah's journey alongside Survivor has touched your hearts. Their story reminds us that sometimes the road less traveled leads to the most meaningful destinations, and that second chances can appear when we least expect them. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories about unexpected connections and the healing power of compassion. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring unique stories that explore life's complexity and the bonds that unite us all, whether between humans or across species. What unexpected encounter changed the course of your life? What second chances have you given or received? We're waiting to hear your stories in the comments section below. Join our community of storytellers, and let's continue this conversation together.